very loud and excited and welcoming as I invite Jake McKay and Gibran Mendez to introduce them.
Joining us today are two critically acclaimed authors, Obreht and Alexi Zentner. Both writers make use of multiple narratives and timelines using mythology and folklore to explore love and mortality. The narrative control and creativity that defines their work allows their prose to move seamlessly through various perspectives and areas to create dense, beautiful action. Obreht's best-selling novel, The Tiger's Wife, was the winner of the 2011 Orange Prize and a finalist for the 2011 National Book Award. Her short fiction has appeared in magazines like The New Yorker and The Guardian. She has been placed among the New Yorker's best writers in the 40 and the National Book Foundation's 5 under 35 for fiction. In her most recent book, The Tiger's Wife, Obreht's wealth of surreal, lush imagery blends with fierce modernist psychologies, enchanting the reader with a mastery of narrative control. She emerges back and forth between narratives, narrators, and worlds separated by time. Obreht's command of every point of view and each reality that her fiction inhibits allows her to relay atrocities as folklore, or to gently educate the reader that the distinction between the two will resolve as people are forced to create their personal mythologies of war.
Zentner's work includes slice-of-life realism alongside magic and mythology, seamlessly fusing myth and reality, past and present, and what he himself refers to as mythological realism. His storytelling accesses every level: carefully crafted prose, creative settings and atmosphere, complex characters, and rich histories challenges readers to reevaluate the concept of truth in fiction. Alexi Zentner's most recent book, The Lobster Kings, has received critical acclaim, and his fiction has been featured in publications including The Atlantic Monthly, Narrative Magazine, Tin House, Glimmer Train, and the Southern Review. He is the winner of both the jury favorite of the O. Henry Prize and the Narrative Prize, as well as being shortlisted for the Best American Short Stories and the Pushcart Prize. He teaches at Binghamton University and in the Sierra Nevada College Low Residency MFA program, and currently lives in Ithaca, New York. Please join us in welcoming Obreht and Alexi Zentner.
Thank you. That was great. We should add that Taya also makes really good chili, which is not really germane. Thanks for coming, even though you have to. Which is great. Keep in mind that there are students all across America right now sitting in rooms just like this, but they're doing statistics. So I'm really happy to be here today. Best readings they go to will be short and funny. It'll be like short-ish, not so funny on the reading, so I apologize in advance. You're getting all the humor right now. This is like all I've got. I've got like 2 more jokes after the reading. I've been known Taya for 9 years. She's like totally my BFF, which means that my only goal today is to embarrass her during the Q&A, which we'll do after we're done our readings. We're going to read for a little bit each, then do Q&A. This is a class, right? So you're graded.
Yes.
So you have to ask questions, and they have to be smart. And the cool thing is we both teach enough that we're totally okay with a thing where we stand up here, there's an awkward silence. It doesn't bother us. You guys will feel really terrible. So thank you for some questions. I'm going to read from my new novel, The Lobster Kings. Taya's going to read from Tiger's Wife, because she only has 1 book, and I have 2. But she's actually a lot more famous than I am, so that's like the only dig I can make. It's just sad. So,
okay, you got the podium now.
I do have the podium now. Yeah. I'm not going to cede it because she's kind of a cold-hearted bitch. No, she's actually mostly nice sometimes. Pretty much the only thing you need to know is that the narrative of this novel is a woman in her 30s, and I know because of this incredible masculine package that might be hard to get over. That's not funny. No, you know. Let me try it again. Because it's incredibly masculine. Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, no, nothing. Just kidding. She's giggling still. So assume that I'm right, which should be fine. And other than that, I'm reading from the beginning of the novel, and you all seem pretty sharp, so I'm guessing you'll figure it out. And if not, then you're probably going to fail the course.
It's really
totally
good.
true. Yeah. Okay. No, seriously though, like here's the thing: there are people, there's like people your age all across the country whose parents, you know, they come home and they're like, I'm gonna take this cool English class. They're like, no, you're not, and they're stuck in these horrible. Can I swear here, right? This is okay. Every once in a while I do an event. I swear a lot. And I apologize. Whatever. I'm swearing away. And every once in a while I do an event. And I swear a lot, and I realize that that event was like for high school students or whatever. And so I try to. Which I know you're not high school students, but whatever. Part of my whole thing is being incredibly awkward and not being able to stop talking or getting myself in the hole, which I'm doing right now. So I don't remember what I was going to swear about. So all right. So now that's. I think there's maybe like one funny line in here. Or no more funnies. Sorry. We're named the kings, and we're the closest thing to royalty on Moosewood Island. The story goes that when the first of the kings, Brumfit Kings the painter, came to Moosewood Island near on 300 years ago, the waters were so thick with lobster that Brumfit only had to sail half of the way from Ireland. It actually doesn't bother me, but I think it's really funny to stop. Aliens. I find myself so much more funny than you guys do. Brumfit only had to sail half of the way from Ireland. He walked the rest of the way, the lobsters making a road with their backs. He was like Jesus walking on the water, except there was no bread to be found anywhere. Lobster there was plenty of. In 1720, the waters were crawling with them in sizes that no man today has seen. To catch his first lobster, Brumfit didn't bother with boats or traps or anything more complicated than simply wading into the water at low tide and gapping a lobster 10 or 20 pounds or more. He caught lobsters 5 feet long. The lobsters are smaller now, but they've done well for the kings. Back when I was a girl in school, we were told about how lobsters used to be cheap trash fish for filling bellies, but it's hard to believe. Daddy and I both drop pots and haul lines, and he's raised all 3 of us girls on the money the lobsters bring in. Raised us well enough, too. Carly, the youngest, teaching in Portland for the last few years after Daddy put her through Colby College. Hard cash that could have gone to buy a 3rd boat. Rena, the middle daughter, like so many of us living on an island that is not claimed by both the U.S. and Canada, taking some schooling on both sides of the border. Sorry, I totally lost my place. The problem is, I wrote it, so I'm supposed to know what's in here, and sometimes in the middle of reading, I forget where I am, and then I'm just screwed. And me. Right, sorry, Mary. The oldest daughter. I went to college too, and I studied art, but as much as I love to paint, I never wanted to paint anything other than Moosewood Island. Never wanted to do anything other than live here and walk the same beaches and paths, painting the same famous landscape that Brumfit Kings painted, and, girl or not, to head to sea to work like Daddy, and his daddy before him, and so on and so forth, all the way back to Brumfit Kings, kings of the ocean, lobster kings. I have 2 sisters, but I'm the one who works the ocean with Daddy. Cordelia Kings, heir to the throne. Daddy likes to say that you can find both the history and the future of the Kings family in Brumfit's paintings. You just have to know where to look. Sometimes I wonder if Brumfit could have imagined a future with me working the water. If Brumfit really predicted that a woman would be the next to wear the king's crown. I said this to Daddy, and he laughed and said that Brumfit painted all of the memories of Moosewood Island, even the ones that hadn't happened yet. And all I had to do was look at the right paintings. But that's the problem. At night, when I'm up late, worried about the legacy and the burden of being a king's, working my way through Brumfit's paintings feels too close to trying to divine my fortune through tea leaves or fortune cookies. I can read things any way that I want, any future and every future laid out for the King's family in the collected works of Brumfit Kings, if I just pick the right paintings in the right order. Some of my skepticism tonight is the heat that has settled in over the island and chased me out of the house. It's late enough that it's close to being early, and I've given up on the tangled sweat of my sheets. Instead, I'm sitting at the edge of the dock. Trudy, my dog, is pacing behind me. I wish I could explain to her that I'm just restless, sleepless, turned out by the heat, that we're not headed to King's Ransom to go fishing. I can hear her panting behind me, but I'm forcing myself to look out over the water and watch the heat lightning paint the sky, instead of turning around and doing what I really want to do, which is stare at the crooked elbow of houses that embrace the harbor. There, by the shoulder, is Daddy's house, the light in the downstairs den left on through the night. And there, near the wrist, is Rena's house, dark for hours, my sister and her husband and the twins all asleep. There, too, is Kenny's house. Kenny Treat, my sternman for the last 5 years, lying in bed with his wife. Out over the water, the lightning spills and ripples and lines like a circulatory system drawn tonight, but there isn't even a lick of thunder, a hint of rain. If I wanted to pick a Bromford painting to match the weather, it would be God's wrath. But God's wrath wouldn't do anything to explain the dizzy spells that Daddy's been having. And God's wrath wouldn't tell me what to do about the talk of James Harbor's drug trade pushing into our waters. And there isn't a Bromford painting in any of the books on my shelves that tells me what I want to hear about Ken Treat, or shows me how to deal with either of my sisters. There's no Bromford King's painting to chase the heat of this night away from you. No hidden messages in the weather. There's just me and Trudy sitting in the dock, just the play of lightning in the sky and the way it's reflected in the water. But with the lightning, and there, the first push of thunder, I don't need Bromford to know that a storm is coming. My own memories start on a boat. I was small enough that Daddy had to cut me down a rod, I think, though it might have just been a stick with some twine tied to it. Whichever it was, it did the trick. I went to cast my line and I hooked Daddy's lower lip with the lure. The meadow was speared completely through the flesh. Blood spilled out of Daddy's mouth, the silver dangled with the lure flashing in the sun. I remember that I cried when he yelled at me, but he says that I've got it wrong, that it was the other way around, that he yelled at me because I cried. That sounds about right for my father. I can't remember why it was just me with him out on the boat, what my sisters were doing, probably at home with your mama, just waiting for your brothers to be born. But he can remember the weather and the low tide time for every day stretching past more than 40 years. He says that's why he married Mom, so he'd have somebody to remember things for him like birthdays. It's the only way he talks about my mother anymore, as if she were some sort of prank he pulled. We weren't out in Daddy's lobster boat, the Queen Jane. I remember that too. The boat was small, a skiff or something borrowed, and my feet got wet from the water in the bottom of the boat. I remember being cold, but there again my father says I'm remembering wrong. It was the beginning of June, he said, the week before Scotty was born, and hot in a way that comes as a surprise any day on Goosewood Island, but particularly that early in the summer. It makes sense that it was June, when the lobsters are busy tucking themselves into rocks and growing new shells. Goosewood Island has a moratorium on, Goosewood Island has its own particularities with the lobstering season. There's a moratorium on catching lobsters from June to the middle of August. It's different in different places, but that's the calendar we work by. So my father would have been maintaining traps to accept the Queen Jane, plenty of downtime ahead of him, enough to take me out fishing. He caught my line with the knife he always kept clipped to his belt, and he told me to quit crying, his voice now soft and calm, the lure hanging bloody from his lip. I put my fishing pole down at the bottom of the boat, snuffled and wiped up my nose with my sleeve. He worked the hook for a little, trying to see if he could thread it back out the way it had come, but he'd been hooked cleanly, the bar pushing up and all the way through. The fishing line flossed in the soft breeze like a streamer. "You've caught yourself a whopper, darling," he said to me. The hook in his lip turned his words into a bloody mumble, and he gave me a smile that made the lure jiggle in the
Oh, sorry.
Someone.
the spoon of the
No, the other door.
She can do it that way.
Oh, she can.
That was terrifying.
Okay.
That happened?
Sorry, Alexi, it happens
Oh.
every day,
Well,
every week.
Totally cool. It's just like, nobody got axed.
It's
Right?
an
So we ever-
every-
Good? Okay. Blood, spoon, bleeding. Okay. He pulled out the tackle box and rooted around in it calmly and slowly, as if he didn't have my hook stuck full through him. The blood flowed dripping down his chin and onto the floor of the boat. It mixed in with the seawater that had been wetting my feet, clouding out, diluted and strange. He took out a pair of pliers and said, "This'll serve." He pulled his lip gently and nestled the pliers against the hook. For a second, I thought he meant to just yank it, ripping out the flesh. And if I hadn't been so afraid, I would have started crying again. Instead, he used the wire cutters and the pliers to snap to the hook. He moved the lure away and worked out the small piece of hook that still hung his lip, holding onto the barbed end with his fingers and drawing the sheared end out of his flesh. As soon as he pulled the metal out, the blood welled up stronger and started to pour down his chin. "We'd best head in, darling," he said to me. "I wouldn't mind getting us cleaned up to see if I need a stitch or two. Besides, it's getting late enough that your mom will be looking for me, really, to give her a hand with her sisters." "And who knows," he said, giving me a wink. "Maybe the baby's on its way." That memory of hooking Daddy blurs with my memory of meeting my baby brother. But I know there were two separate events. It would have been a week or so after the fishing trip that Scotty came home from the hospital. The thin, ugly stitches knotted on Daddy's lip were only partly disguised by the growth of his beard. I remember standing on the deck of the Queen Jane and getting my first look at my baby brother. It doesn't make sense to me now. Why wouldn't Mama have been out there with the baby? But at the time it felt normal to be out of the Queen Jane without Mama, without my sisters. I'm sure it was just Daddy, my brother, and me. Daddy sat on the captain's chair, cradling the baby. Scotty was crying, the sort of mule that comes from newborns, and I thought, he doesn't like it here. Doesn't like it on the boat, doesn't like it on the water. I understood right at that moment that he was just like my sisters. Scotty didn't belong in the Queen Jane any more than they did. And as I had that realization, Daddy scooped me up and into his lap, and I thought, Daddy sees it too. I remember what it felt like to burrow against him, to be looking down at Scotty, the surge of pleasure and the understanding that I thought I shared with Daddy, the belief that I was the one who was meant to be out in the water with him. Daddy was a loving father, but he was certainly not a cuddly one, and to be on his lap was a privilege rarely afforded. I felt like a commoner sitting on the throne. But as Scotty kept crying, Daddy looked at me and then nodded at Scotty and said, Here, look at him, Cordelia. This is your brother. Look at him, because he carries with him the weight of our history, the lineage of the King's family. Even though I know that I can't actually remember the words with such exactitude, I was only 3 and a half when Scotty was born. But those words wouldn't have made any sense to me at the time. I can still hear every word that Daddy said. Look at him, he said. Look at this little boy, Cordelia, because he is both our past and our future. There's going to be a day when he takes over the family business, when he's out in the water, and Scotty Kings is going to be the king of Loose Island. He leaned over and kissed me on the head then and asked me if I wanted to hold Scotty. I nodded. I didn't really want to hold him. He was just a baby, I thought. Small and loud and deserved of nothing. And Daddy had already decided to give him what I knew to be my birthright as the firstborn, girl or not. As much as I could feel Daddy's arms around me, holding me on his lap and holding Scotty steady, I could also feel something else. I could feel with a certainty as loud as Scotty's increased cries that this was not a boy who was born to rule the sea. And I remember this too, but I know it can't have been real. Daddy standing up, stepping over the edge of the boat, and walking across the water to shore with me and Scotty in his arms, walking across the top of the ocean, taking me home to Mama, Rena, and Carla. Thanks. Just kidding.
Just hang out there.
That's such a brat. I'm so
You
sorry.
left your book and your sunglasses. I'm going to read from your book now. Thanks so much for having us both. This is really fun, and it's always extra fun when I get to hang out with Alexi and make chili, which is then praised publicly.
It was like seriously awesome.
I have a fallback position in case this doesn't work out. I can go somewhere and make chili for the rest, for all of time. I too am going to be. Thank you also so much for the introduction. I'm going to be reading from Tiger's Wife, and I will also be reading from a section that should be attributed to a different voice than mine. The book is about a young doctor who's trying to figure out the mystery of her grandfather's disappearance and death, which sort of happens off screen at the beginning of the book. And she pieces his life together from stories that he told her about a relationship that he had with a particular man throughout the course of his own life as a doctor. So most of the book is from her point of view, but this particular section is first person from the grandfather's perspective. So although I am not an elderly gentleman, I ask you to envision me as one here, maybe a little taller, beard. I used to do the voice, but I only did that at my first reading and then never did it. I learned a lot of things at that reading. I read for the first time 2 days after my book came out, and it was a big crowd, and somebody asked me during the Q&A about the ending of the book. And I didn't think about this in sort of in the temporal sense at all, and I answered the question. And of the 150 people who were there, 149 hadn't read the book, except for this one guy who buzzed through it through the end. And I was like, oh yeah, this happens at the end. And realized it when people's faces sort of fell into this rictus of rage. And I was like, oh man. Anyway, so that's unrelated. So this is the grandfather telling the story in, again, this is late summer, 1954, not 55, because that was the year I met your grandmother. I am first triage assistant for the battalion, and my apprentice, God rest him, or intern as you would call it these days, is this brilliant little Hungarian fellow who has paid a lot of money to study at our university, but who doesn't speak a word of the language. God knows why he's not in Paris or London. He's that apt with a scalpel, but he's not apt at much else. At any rate, this call comes in from the village where there is a sickness. Some people have died, and those still living are afraid. There is a terrible cough and blood on their pillows in the morning. This is about as mysterious to me as an empty milk saucer when there's a big fat cat in the room, and the cat has a ring of milk on its whiskers, and everyone is asking where the milk is. So we hitch a wagon ride to this village. The man who greets us is called Marek. He is the son of the big man in town and has been to university. He is the man who sent the wire asking us to come. He is short and stocky, and he leads us through the village and into his father's house. Marek's sister is this fat, pleasant-looking woman, very much what you'd expect. She gives us coffee and bread with cheese, which is a nice change from all that porridge we've been eating back at barracks. And then Marek says, "Gentlemen, something new is at hand." And I expect that he will say, the epidemic's gotten worse, more death, mass hysteria, and I'm partly right, especially about the hysteria. Apparently, this is how it stands. A man has died, and there has been a funeral. At the funeral, this man, who is called Gavo, sits up in his coffin and asks for water. It is an immense surprise. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the procession is following the casket up the churchyard slope to the plot. First, there's the noise of the body sliding in the coffin, and when the lid comes off, there he is, this man Gavo, as pale and blue-faced as the day they found him floating belly up in a pond some way from town. Gavo sits up in his pressed suit, hat in hand, folded purple napkin in his pocket. An immense surprise. High up, held aloft in his coffin like a man in a boat, he looks around the procession with red eyes and says, "Water." That is all. By the time the pallbearers have realized what's happened, by the time they've dropped the coffin and fled like crazy men into the church, this man has already fallen back into the casket. That is what Marek tells us regarding this new development. From where we are sitting in Marek's house, I can see out the open door and down the road leading across the field and through the churchyard. I have only just noticed that the town is very empty, and that at the door of the little church there is a man with a pistol, the undertaker, Marek tells me, who hasn't slept for 6 days. I am already thinking it would be far more productive to help this man, the undertaker. Meanwhile, Marek is still telling the story, and in it, the man Gavo does not rise from his coffin again. This is helped by the fact that some unknown member of the funeral procession fires 2 bullets from an army pistol into the back of Gavo's head while he is sitting up in the coffin right after the pallbearers drop it. Never mind why someone is so very prepared to fire a gun at a funeral. Marek only tells this part of the story after he has had 2 or 3 glasses of plum brandy. I am taking notes this whole time and wondering about how this Gavo ties into the sickness I am there to treat. When Marek mentions the 2 bullets, I put my pencil down and say, "So, the man was not dead." No, Marek says, "Most assuredly he was dead." Before the bullets were fired, I ask him because it seems to me that this whole business is taking a different route, and now they're just making things up to cover murder. Marek shrugs and says, "It is a surprise, I know." I continue to write, but what I'm writing does not make much sense, and Marek looks with interest across the table and reads what I'm writing upside down. My assistant, who I suspect has not understood any of this, is staring intently at me for some sort of explanation. I say, "We will have to see the body." Marek's hands are on the table, and I can see that he is a man who bites his nails when he is nervous. He has been biting them a lot recently. He says to me, "Are you sure that's necessary?" "We'll have to see it. I don't know about that, doctor." I've been making a list of all the people I want to speak with, anyone who is sick, all the family members of this revenant fellow, Gavo, and especially the priest and undertaker, who are most likely to know about his condition before he was shot. I say to Marek, many people are at risk here. If the man was sick, he was not sick. I'm sorry, he was perfectly healthy. My assistant is looking in abject confusion from Marek to myself. He has known me long enough to process that the expression on my face is probably not one of delight, and he is obviously puzzled by what is going on. Marek himself doesn't look too good either. I say, very well, I will tell you how I see it. As far as the village goes, including Mr. Gabo himself, I am confident that my findings will probably arrive at a diagnosis of consumption, tuberculosis. It is consistent with the symptoms you described to me, the bloody cough and so forth. I would like to have all the people who are sick assembled in your town hospital as quickly as possible, and would like to place the town under quarantine until we can assess the extent of the illness. And here, he catches me off guard because he says sharply, what do you mean tuberculosis? He looks very distraught, and I would expect him to be distraught with tuberculosis. But I would expect a different kind of alarm. The way he looks at me, I feel like my diagnosis doesn't suit him. It's inadequate, not severe enough. Marek says, couldn't it be something else? I tell him no, not with these symptoms, not with people falling dead one by one and leaving bloody pillows behind. I tell him it will be all right. I will send for medicine from nurses and another city physician to help me. He wants to know, what if that doesn't help? I tell him it will. If it's tuberculosis, he says, if you're right. I'm not entirely certain where this is going. What if you're wrong? Marek says, what if it's something else? By this time, he's very agitated, and he says, I don't think you understand, sir. I really doubt you understand. I ask him to tell me about it. Well, says Marek, there is blood on our pillows, and there was blood on the lapels of Gavo's coat, because you shot him. Marek almost falls out of his seat. I didn't shoot him, doctor. He was already dead. I'm scribbling again, mostly just to look official. My assistant is sweating in frustration. I say I will need to speak with this man's family. He has no family. He's not from around here. He was some sort of peddler from far away. We didn't know anything about him. We wanted to do right by burying him here. To me, this is becoming more and more frustrating, but I think maybe that's why they're all suddenly coming down with tuberculosis. Maybe he was infected and brought it in, even though he seemed perfectly healthy. But then, he has only been here for a short time, certainly not enough to get the whole village sick, but obviously long enough for them to shoot him in the back of the head. Who will give me permission, I ask, to dig up the body? You don't need it. Marek is wringing his hands. We nailed the coffin shut, and then we put him in the church. He's still in there. So there we are, my assistant and I, standing in the little stone church at Bistrina, and the coffin of the man called Gabo is there, lying at an angle from the door, as if it's been shoved in pretty quickly. It's a dusty wooden coffin. The church is stone and quiet. It smells of sandalwood and wax, and there is an icon of the Virgin above the door. The windows are blue glass. It is a beautiful church, but it is obvious that no one has been in it for a long time. The candles are all out, and this fellow Gabo's coffin is covered with a few spatters of white, which the doves that live in the belfry have been dropping down on him. It is a sad thing to see, because as far as I know, this man has done nothing to deserve being shot in the back of the head at his own funeral twice. After we come in, the undertaker closes the door behind us quickly and suddenly, and for a long time, everything is quiet in the little church. We've come in with our satchels, and we've also brought a crowbar to open the coffin, and we begin to realize that perhaps we should have brought in more than just the crowbar. A team of oxen, for example, because the coffin, thank you, because the coffin has not only been nailed shut, but also crisscrossed with extra boards across the lid and chained around and around with what looks like a bicycle chain. Someone, probably as an afterthought, has thrown a string of garlic onto the coffin, and the heads are there lying in their paper shells. My assistant manages to say to me, shame, awful shame. Then he spits and says, peasants. And then we hear something that is altogether incredible, something you cannot even begin to appreciate, because without hearing for yourself the way it sounded in the quiet church, you won't believe it happened. It is the sound of shuffling movement, and then, all of a sudden, a voice from the coffin, a frank, polite, slightly muffled voice that says, water. Thank you.
You guys are like super serious about conserving energy here.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe not you personally.
I feel like if the light had gone out maybe 2 minutes after it did, it would have been really cool for the ending of that
So it's
section.
going to be like, it's going to be like water. Can't do a mic drop. Questions?
Flip the table.
It's Albert. I read,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know how true it is because I read it on Wikipedia, but I read that one of your influences was Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and if it's so, which piece of work were the most influential for you?
Sure. Thank you for that. I read Love in the Time of Cholera first, and I loved it. And I've since read so many of his other things, but that one remains my favorite. And actually, you and I agree on this that it's the best one.
But most people will say I'm going to go to solitude, but I don't think it's. I mean, I think generally consensus is that people will always say that's a better book. I think Love and Cholera is such a good book.
That's the time of, but I love in the Time of Cholera. It's a fantastic book, and it gets it's one of those books that every time you read it, you actually find more and more and more in the layers. Which I read an interview with him or something that he had written about it, and he had said that his hope was that on the first read, the reader would be trapped, that the reader would fall into his trap, because people when people read it, they're like, oh, this is a beautiful romantic book, but then as you go deeper and deeper into it, over and over again, there's horrible things in that book. All the characters are horrific, and it's a wonderful exercise in playing with your reader. So, thank you. Oh, sorry.
There was somebody over.
Yeah, Alexi. As a man, did you run into any challenges writing a believable female protagonist?
I don't. It's funny because I started getting the question a lot when the book came out, and it just hadn't occurred to me. And the question was, why did you choose? A lot of times I get the question, why do you choose to write in the voice of a woman? And sort of the honest answer is, why not? Which is not a super helpful answer. And I think the longer answer is that what writers get trapped by is the idea that they're going to write sort of the woman's voice. And the thing is, there is no such thing. What you have to write is a specific woman's voice, and I could not have written, women, but I could write Cordelia specifically. And so, writing a specific character, and I think anytime you write anything, you're stepping outside of yourself. I mean, anytime you write anything that's not just pure memoir, you're already a mental character. So I actually didn't particularly feel challenged by it. I mean, there were, in the editing process, there were one or two little things where my editor said, that seems a little bit off. There was once or twice where just I referenced a type of shoe, and I had to Google because I didn't know wedges. I know there's a wedge and a heel, right? So little things like that. But no, I think that it's it's not writing from the voice of a specific woman is no more challenging than writing from the voice of somebody who's old and younger than you, or different sexuality than you. And to me, the whole joy of writing fiction is getting to make shit up. Yeah.
I'm wondering how much of your process happens in redrafting, and how much of deciding where the point of view changes and how to create those transitions.
I think that's a great question. I think I love redrafting. My first draft is always the hardest one, and I think that often, and I mean that's not the case for everybody. I know writers who are like, I can't, I really can't stand to edit, and I know that my first thought is my best thought, and that's it. But I, I think that often in a first draft, you are making mistakes. And as you go through and as things start to gel more and more and you start to form the real world of the novel, you begin to realize, or even the short story, you begin to realize how those transitions are going to have to take place. From point of view, temporal transitions, transitions of maybe even the same character's perspective from a different temporal point, and that all comes in redrafting. Often, the first draft for me is one voice, very very flat, and then the sort of extractions and negotiations start to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the trap is that when you read a book, you look at the finished thing, so you see, you know, oh, they wrote a book. It's like, no, I wrote 49 drafts and you're getting the 50th. That being said,
but the 48th was better. And now,
yeah,
no,
I hate revision. I don't think it's fun, but it's how you make a book go from good to great. And the thing is, when you're talking literary fiction, when you're talking art, okay, versus commercial fiction, I don't have a problem with commercial fiction. When you're talking art, the difference between 98% and 100% is the difference between not getting published. And that tiniest fraction is the thing that you have to fix. And you know, revision gets you that the rest of the way. And I think what revision does is it allows you to think intellectually and analytically about a process that is inherently intuitive. Because the drafting process is incredibly intuitive. And once you've got that first draft, and once you start to revision, is when you can look back at it and step back and say, how do I approach this as a full text, as opposed to how do I approach this as a piece of art? And when you can do both of those things, that's when you can, you know, write books that kill. And my experience has been that, particularly with younger writers. Well, my experience has been particularly with younger writers.
See what I know. Sorry.
For most people, I mean, I think you actually need. I think for most people, the first draft is the fun part. I think a lot more people like me, where the first draft is fun and revision is just it's work. And you know, a lot of young writers, they do a first draft and they do a revision and say, okay, I've done the work. I've done the work. And it's like, no, you've done one of your first many revisions. And you know, even accepting what revision means, or revision literally means to see again. And you know, a lot of times when I'm teaching undergrads, revision means spell check. That's not revision. So I think it's a lot of it. Sometimes like I think sometimes you get lucky. Every once in a while you write something and you finish your first draft and you're like,
done.
All right, done. But that's, yeah. I think that happens more the longer you write.
I think so, because I think that you become aware of, if you're actually honest with yourself in the process of revision, you can shorten it for yourself the more you write, because you know your ticks, you know where your mistakes are going to lie, and you know what traps you're going to fall into in terms of the crutches that you use to get you from one place to the next, and you can sort of cut that off before it happens.
But being honest with yourself sucks.
Yeah.
I mean, it does. And I'm not kidding. Like for me, most of my revision process is my editor finding the thing that I hope she wouldn't notice, that I thought I could get by with, and she finds it, and I'm like, fuck. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a good point where when you go for a conversation with an editor who's been working on a short story or a nonfiction piece or even your novel, and you know practically everything they're going to say before they say it, like then you know that you can actually trust yourself, and you sort of have that like.
Yeah. I can't. I'm not sure, but I can think of a time when somebody's given me comments that were smart comments that didn't that I wasn't kind of, it's really rare that comes out left field. But that's, again, I think the thing is the difference between when you're talking art, and art of any kind, it's moving past your sort of own ego to be able to say, what's the best thing for the art, not, you know, what's the best thing for me. And that's, I think, really difficult to do.
We went to grad school. We went to the MFA at Cornell together.
It was a really small program, and yeah, I guess that sounds a boring story.
Yeah.
The Army.
Well, I made this fantastic pot of chili once, and no.
Yeah, I know grad school. Yeah, that's a boring story.
I used to babysit for his kids when
That
they were
too,
really
yeah.
in grad school.
There should be more to that.
Yeah.
You know what, actually, you know what is part of that story though, is that
Go ahead.
in a small program, one of the things that's actually exciting about being in a program is that, you know, when you go to a graduate program, everybody who gets to grad school was the smartest kid in the room. Like, you don't get into grad school unless you were the best at wherever you were. And you're kind of used to that. And when you go to school, you know, for me, going into workshop the first time I read Taya's stuff, you know, I read her first story, and my response was, okay, I got to step it up. And that's really helpful to have a period, particularly, you know, you get along, where you're pushing each other. Well, I don't know how much I pushed her, but for me at least, you know, to say, like, okay, I need to be more ambitious.
You know that thing that happens in cartoons where they can only get out of the canyon by
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you guys, sorry, did that make sense to anybody? Okay, sorry.
Has anyone seen The Emperor's New Groove?
Dude, come on! Alright, sorry.
How much of the time do you say that when you're working on a new story, you make an outline before you start, or you just leave into it? Because I've read a lot of, like, some authors will just jump into it and see where it goes, and others spend a lot of time planning out. And I've done both. I want to hear what you think.
For me, it's 100% of the time. I actually can't write a short story, much less start a bigger project, unless I give myself the illusion that I know where it's going. Because often it will veer off, you know. Characters will develop a mind of their own and start wandering off the page and like doing random shit in the corner, and they're like, stop, come back. But it's for me, it's important to, something happens to my brain when I know that there's sort of that the parentheses on the end is closed, and there's this idea that I can see the whole thing from the beginning. I know writers who can just leap in and it takes them anywhere, and then afterwards they outline. But I outline before I start, and then when I'm finished, whether it's a short story or a novel, I outline what I have, and then I try to see what the ultimate thing will be. I try to outline what I have rather than what I wish it were.
I don't do that because I'm one of those idiots who tells you what to do and doesn't follow my advice. But outlining, like diagramming what you have after you've written it is a really good way to figure out where it's not working. And so I do that with my students all the time, and I should probably do it for myself, but whatever.
You were big on graphs. I'm sorry to interrupt
Yeah.
You explain graphs because you were always big on that.
Well, visually, I mean, if you can't describe a story, if you can't visually describe what you've written, then your thing's a fucking mess. You should be able to do a drawing that's representative of the structure of your work. If you can't, there's almost always a structural problem. But to answer your question, I'm sort of in between. I don't outline, but I always have a sense of what the first scene is. I always have a sense of what something in the middle is, and then always what the ending is. And the analogy I use is kind of like driving from here to LA and knowing you have to stop in Denver, but you don't actually have a map. And so that seems to work okay for me. But same thing, like almost everything I've written, I've sometimes changed partway through, but I've always known what the ending was going to be. Now, half the time as I'm writing it, that ending kind of fizzles away, but I have to have a sense of where I'm going. But it really totally depends on where you are.
And I think that it can depend on the work from, I think that one writer can address one piece one way and then another the other way. It sort of depends on where the impetus to write that particular piece comes from. And sometimes it's this sort of long, you have an idea for a character and it's this long, sprawling thing, and you're like, I'll just catch it on the other end and fix it there. And sometimes you just can't even put pen to paper without this map.
Yeah. A lot of people start with voice and go from there. But I will say, and this I'm sure it's probably wasn't really I'm probably a joy as your professor, but a lot of times what happens is you get people who are like, well, I don't outline, and I need to wait for that moment to strike, and that's their excuse to not start. So don't let that be you. It's really easy to be like, well, I have to wait for the muse to come.
But I do that and it works.
But you don't, because you're doing stuff for writing.
Yeah.
So you don't start typing right away.
Yeah.
But you're doing the work, the reading and the work and the thinking. Your writing is not physically.
Yeah, I think that and there's actually writers who I know who do this. I do this, and there's people that I know. But you're writing a tremendous amount that you know is going to go in the trash, and it's the worst feeling in the world because you know that unless you work through this, you're not going to get to the other side of it where you have your actual voice and your actual outline, your actual idea for what's going on. And it can feel like you're waiting around because you know that it's going in the trash. And that's a horrible feeling. Enjoy that.
Great.
We're here to motivate.
Well, we'll do one more if anyone has. Jake.
You each use these multiple timelines and narratives, and I was wondering what the advantages and setbacks are between doing that in your work as opposed to writing like more like linear centralized things.
Oh god, it's such a huge pain in the ass. It's so much harder to do. I don't like if you can not do it, it's just easier. Like the first of all, in a novel, like keeping track of everything is actually hard. Like I keep these big canvases that I write names and stuff on. The novel I'm working on right now, I think I've got 70 named characters. 64 of them are minor, but you can't, like I don't want to be like every time I go into the store, be like, oh god, what was his name? And then trying to figure out when things happen. The other issue is for a reader. Every time you're moving forward, and every time you stop to go back, that reader has to stop with you. And so to nuance that stopping and starting is actually really difficult. But you get depth.
And you have to those I think nuance stops and starts have to feel. I think the reader. I think it's easier to get a reader. It's more difficult to get a reader to trust you when you're doing those stops and starts because when we read, what we look for is pattern. And the faster a book can teach you how to read it, the more. So linear structure is just like I started at the beginning, I'm gonna get to the end, and time will pass. But when you're dealing with going back in time, the first couple of times you do it, when you make a transition to something that's happened in the past, your reader's like, what is going on? Without fail, because that's how the human mind works for narrative structure. Yeah.
It's also, it depends on what you're writing. I mean, I'm vastly oversimplifying, but his first book and both my first two books are in a lot of ways about storytelling, which means that by the nature of what they are, they require that going back and telling stories. There are other stories that are not about that. So it's a good start.
It's also how you think, right? And I think that has to do with, that's another element of getting in touch with the honest aspect of who you are as a writer or somebody who creates anything. It's that, I love reading linear narrative, but I don't like to inhabit it when I'm thinking about my own work. It's, and it's sort of I'm comfortable there, in switching timelines, and I find it very difficult to write in a linear way because I'm like I always want to explain.
Yeah. And I still think it's that the multiple timelines allows you to layer. And I think what you're shooting for, we were talking about this with Gabriel Garcia Marquez, what you're always shooting for when you're, again, this is between art and commercial work, is that with art, you're shooting for something that every time somebody comes to it, they get something new. And that just requires, palimpsest. Sort of work written on top of work, written on top of work, written on top of work. So every time you read it, you can see new things kind of showing through.
And I think that on some level that happens naturally when you write with integrity, and by that I mean all of us are preoccupied with particular questions at particular times in our lives. And in your 20s it could be one thing, in your 30s it could be another. And when you write or when you paint or when you write a song, it's usually to work through, if it's coming from a place of integrity, it's usually to work through a particular question that is preoccupying you at the time. And that will immediately add layers of meaning that you aren't even aware are there. Like it'll come out. You're like, oh, clearly I was obsessed with Skittles at this particular time, and that's why there's so many Skittles in this, So yeah.
Yeah, what the author meant never, or intended, almost never matters.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but at least for me, I only forget out what my books are about once they got reviewed by somebody smart. No, seriously, I had a really early review of Lost Kings. This guy was like, it was one of the smartest reviews I've ever read, and I read it and I'm like, holy shit, that's totally what the book is about. And like, maybe one of the 5 things he pulled out had I intended.
Yeah.
He was talking about globalism. I'm like, oh my god, and like all these things, I was like, they're absolutely in the textbook.
Yeah.
Of course I did that on purpose, because as an artist, I have no idea.
You didn't ask a question, I would leave it there.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, what inspired these 2 stories? Because usually for me, I just have an idea and I go with it. But I just wanted to know if anything inspired you guys to write these 2 specific?
Mine, I was out on an vacation. I love the landscape. I've got 2 daughters. I'm really interested in the questions for fathers and children, and what it means to sort of, for a daughter to have to live up to father's expectations, particularly in a role that is traditionally reserved for men. And then as I started writing it, some of the comparisons to Lear, King Lear, really came out. And King Lear the question about King Lear is what does it mean to give up a kingdom? Which I don't think is a very interesting question, but I think what does it mean to inherit a kingdom is actually really interesting. So kind of that. I can say that now. At the time, I was like, oh, oats.
By that same token, I was like, oh, tigers. Yeah, no. For the tigers, my grandfather died, and what I didn't realize, I wrote a short story for the workshop that we were in that was about a circus performer and her pet tiger, and it was an abominable short story. But actually, in that original draft, I remember, this is important. I remember Alexi, the piece was like crucified in the workshop. It went over really, really badly. And Alexi being the primary orchestrator of that. I am the judge and the jury in one. But I remember one of his comments being, there's a mob scene in this, and they're wielding actual pitchforks. I want you to think about that. Because the story is not, in fact, Frankenstein. And I was like, oh, right. It's not. But it was totally not, and like that's what criticism helps. But so I wanted to write a story in which a tiger is featured, but then it ended up having all this death background that again I wasn't really clued into. I think maybe in the last third of it I was like, who's about a grandfather? My grandfather just died. Huh.
But you get it's like, when you're starting out as an artist, these things are things you have to work through, and we're all so impatient. It takes a long time. The thing about it is that we're obviously kind of self-deprecating, and I probably could not have said at that exact moment why I was doing it. I can go back and do it, but the reason why it works is because we've spent so much time on it that we have the foundations, so that when we're working on an intuitive level, we have everything underneath it so that we're ready to go. And it takes a long time. The first things I wrote were really bad. I keep actually in my office on campus where I teach. I keep a stack of rejection letters back. This was before people used email for rejection letters, and it's about that freaking tall. And I keep it because one of the things that's important is for young writers to understand that sometimes she's not here, but normally you're supposed to fail a lot before you get better. I think you have a rejection letter once, but generally it takes a long time to get there, and only later we I think figure out exactly what you do.
But even no, I think that's true. But also, I mean, I think that I started writing younger than you did, and I started.
She was writing, even though Ted is younger than me. She was writing seriously longer than I had been when we met, even though I was like 14 and a half years older than her.
Right, but that's the kind of thing where I think that often people who,
petty and jealous.
no, oh my god, oh my god. And then I had a nervous breakdown. No, but I think now about the work that I did when I was like, and it sounds ridiculous to say, and it is ridiculous to say, like, when I was 13, I wrote a book. But when I was 13, I wrote a book. And it was a shitty book, but the practice was there. And I think that when even when you're doing bad work when you're young, like, you have to get through the hump. And like, some people get through it early, and some people get through, I know writers who had their first novel published when they were 50 years old, and they had started working through the schlock when they were like 25. So there might be people here who are like, well, I have like 3 dragon novels in my drawer, and I don't know, people will mock me, and like maybe those dragon novels will like never see the light of day, but you did them, and that's work, that you've worked through. Those are lessons that you've learned. So
we're like 400 yards from your original question.
Yeah.
My question was, I'm sorry.
Oh, what? Yeah, I don't remember.
Good.